In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. As I get older, that statement, his body was as good as dead, starts to hit a little too close to home. Uh-oh. Christian Herter was governor of Massachusetts in the 1950s. One day, after a busy morning chasing votes and going without lunch, he arrived at a church barbecue. Herter was famished. As he moved down the serving line, he held out his plate to the lady serving the chicken. She put one piece on his plate and turned to the next person in line. "Excuse me," Governor Herter said. "Do you mind if I have another piece?" "Sorry," she told him. "I'm only allowed to give one piece to each person." "But I'm starved," the governor said. "Sorry, only one per person." Governor Herter was usually an unassuming man, but this time he decided to throw his weight around a little. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "I'm the governor of this state." "Do you know who I am?" the woman replied. "I'm the church lady in charge of the chicken." "Move on." Was the meal that Jesus shared with questionable people the precursor to the church potluck? Today's gospel gives us the story of the call to discipleship of a tax collector named Matthew that leads to a meal shared with him, other tax collectors, as well as various sinners. Today's gospel reading is a real mixed bag, as we're told that Jesus heals the leader of the synagogue's daughter, as well as the healing of a woman who has been sick for a very long time. We know from the Gospels of Mark and Luke that the man is Jairus, and it is his daughter whom Jesus raises from the dead. Along with Jesus, his friend Lazarus, and the son of the widow of Nain, these are the three recorded instances when Jesus raises people from the dead. However, Jesus brings them back to life as a form of resuscitation. This is not resurrection. That has not happened yet for Jesus. I was ordained a priest on June 29th, 1883. Oh, wait a minute. 2003. On the feast day of St. Peter and Paul. And that's when I started preaching on most Sundays. I shared those duties for the first 2 years of my ministry with the rector of St. John's, Huntington, New York on Long Island, whenever he was actually there. Prior to that, I had been preaching on occasion at both my sponsoring parish as well as the cathedral right here in Milwaukee, where I was seminarian for 2 years until I was ordained a deacon. Because we exist in a 3-year lectionary cycle, which means years A, B, and C come up every 3 years, this year is year A, and year A has come up 6 times since I started preaching. 2023, 2020, 2017, 2014, 2011, 2008, when I met you, and 2005. And because the season after Pentecost finishes with the last Sunday in Pentecost, when the gospel is always the Transfiguration, followed by Christ the King Sunday, the end of the church year, and a feast day that doesn't get near what I think it should get for recognition, subject for another day, the readings essentially work backwards from those Sundays. This is what the Roman Catholics call ordinary time. Not because it's ordinary like mundane or commonplace. It comes from the Latin word ordinalis, which means numbered. Ordinary time signifies a numbered or ordered list of Sundays. As for the beginning of ordinary time, as you know, Easter moves forwards and backwards. A situation that originally tied in with Passover and the Jewish Nisan, with Easter ending up being the first Sunday after the full moon that occurs on or after the spring equinox. Luckily, we don't have to calculate that for ourselves. Well, first of all, we have the internet. Second of all, and if it's on there, that's the truth. We also have tables for this in our prayer book with a detailed explanation on pages 880 to 885. Yours might be different. I have an older version of the prayer book, which has the prayer book lectionary in it, not the revised common lectionary, which we now use. Because the starting point in the assigned readings, or propers, can be early or late, Easter has not fallen early enough to allow proper 5 that we heard today to be used in year A since 2005, which was the last time I preached on this gospel. Even if I was prone to recycling old sermons, that would be difficult today as we are living in a very different post-COVID world in 2023. And while the wound of 9/11 was still very raw in 2005, especially in New York. And while it's not a huge deal for us, if your patron saint is Matthew and you're attending St. Matthew's Church, then you only get to hear the story of him being called by Jesus roughly once every 2 decades. I find this quite odd, as Matthew was not only an apostle, he was also one of the authors of the 4 Gospels. I would have thought his story was important enough to be heard at least once every 3 years. After all, year A is almost exclusively devoted in its readings from his gospel. That said, Matthew does have his own holy day on September 21st. But that gospel reading, while overlapping with the beginning of today's, ends before Jesus meets with Jairus. I can therefore assume that the folks that assembled the lectionary felt that leaving open the option to celebrate Matthew's calling once a year was good enough, despite the fact that the rest of the gospel story, well, in our case, hasn't occurred since 2005. So who was this man? Who was this Matthew, who's referred to as Levi in the Gospels of Mark and Luke? What we do know is this influential follower of Christ wrote his gospel around the years AD 60 to 65 to a group of recent converts to Christianity, who still had one foot firmly planted in the Jewish faith. Perhaps it is his response to being called by Jesus that is the real story here. He just gets up and goes, leaving behind a lucrative career as a tax collector. Men in this profession typically kept a certain percentage of their take, and most took full advantage of their fellow Jewish citizens as well as all traveling merchants. As a tax collector, Matthew would have had a really bad reputation of being a cheat, a grifter of sorts, and in general, quite corrupt. He would have been despised by the Jews and mistrusted by the Romans, to whom he reported directly. Jesus calls Matthew, and they go to eat dinner together, where we hear of this motley crew seated at the table consisting of more tax collectors and those who are simply described as sinners. What exactly is a sinner? One source that I researched offered this. In those days, sinners fell into 5 basic categories. People who did dirty things for a living, such as pig farmers and tax collectors. People who did immoral things, such as liars and adulterers. And people who did not keep the law up to the standards of the religious authorities. A broad category indeed. And lastly, Samaritans and Gentiles. These are who Jesus sits and eats with. Shocking. Jesus sits with sinners, eats with sinners. And he does this because he knows that it is not the healthy that need a doctor. It is the sick. One of my favorite quotes, attributed to Abigail Van Buren, better known as Dear Abby. The church is not a hotel for saints. It is a hospital for sinners. Profound indeed. If it was the famous agony aunt who originally coined it. I had a Lutheran retired pastor as a parish administrator in my last church. You know him. He used to say, just say Augustine said it. And if that doesn't work, use St. Francis. Today's gospel not only introduces us to Matthew, it also hints at the flaws in some of the Jewish purity laws. Because he was a tax collector, Matthew was essentially unclean. So were all the other sinners that Jesus ate with. Being touched by the sick woman also rendered Jesus ritually unclean, as would the holding of the hand of the dead girl. Through these various accounts of events that we have no reason not to believe are not true, today's gospel becomes a cross-section of Jesus' ministry. The calling of a tax collector, hanging out with sinners, healing the sick, and raising the dead. The entire 9th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew is filled with Jesus healing the blind, the sick, and even the dead. Is Matthew 9 a realistic look into the day of the life of Jesus? Probably so. Because if Jesus were to walk through almost any city in the world today, he would quickly encounter the same types of tragic waste, homelessness, wanton need, and sickness that we read about throughout the entire 9th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Not only does today's gospel reading introduce us to one of the more important members of Jesus' growing entourage, it gives us an idea of the nature of the behavior exhibited by Jesus during his ministry. Behavior that would essentially cause him to be despised by the religious leaders, if he hadn't done that already. Virtually every aspect of today's gospel reading shows us just how counterculture Jesus really was, and why he would have rubbed the religious leaders the wrong way. These corrupt men would come to hate him so much that they would ultimately seek to rid themselves of his meddling ways. They finally killed him. Jesus could not have been more accurate when he warned that following him would be difficult and not without costs. But nothing good in this life comes easy. But if we do follow Christ, then the reward could not be greater. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.